This video is about why do you need a handbrake? Starting with cable handbrakes, we're going to talk about pros and cons of each of these options. With cable handbrakes, some of the pros might be just cost-effective labor savings, so you won't need to do a whole lot of work in order to get this to work. The cons are going to be, it's not going to be very effective. You are going to be stretching the cable on the first event, almost guaranteed. Stretching the cable means when you're pulling the handbrake hard enough to lock up the rear wheels. Typically, a factory handbrake uses cables and a drum inside of the rear rotor. This does not have the leverage or surface area required to lock up wheels while they're spinning and while they're moving. It is literally just for parking a car and keeping it from rolling down a 10 to 15 degree grade hill. That's pretty much it. Some things that companies have come out with are extended sticks that you can slip on over top of your factory handbrake. This gives you more leverage to pull, but again, it's going to stretch the cable. Yeah, those are the pros and cons of a cable handbrake. Inline handbrake with stock master cylinder. And by stock master cylinder, I mean stock braking system. So you haven't done anything to improve or change the braking system. Okay, let's talk about it. Hooking up an inline master cylinder to your car without changing anything else is going to have a couple pros. It is going to lock up the rear wheels much easier. It is cost effective and it is going to work given you aren't pushing the foot brake at the same time. Here are where the negative parts come in, the cons. If you push the foot brake and pull the handbrake at the same time, you are going to notice a couple things that are a bit strange. And the way this works is that there are different channels inside the master cylinder that are going to drive the front brakes and drive the rear brakes. With that said, if you lock up the rear brakes, you are going to limit one of those chambers in the master cylinder, and it is going to prevent you from applying pressure to the front brakes. So when you push the foot brake and pull the handbrake at the same time, you are going to have little to no brake pressure at the other wheels that are basically not connected to the handbrake. So this is what I would consider a temporary solution. It is not a permanent solution. This is something that you would do if you need to save money and the car is for track use only, and you just want the ability to feel out and use a handbrake. Inline handbrake with a pedal box or with a changed brake system or an upgraded braking system. So let's talk about this. This is where an inline handbrake is totally fine to use in a car. There are some pros to running an inline handbrake with a pedal box. Some of them are just the fact that you have a single set of calipers in the rear, so you're saving unsprung weight. You have pads that are pre-warmed up by the foot brake, so you know that this is going to lock up really, really well. To go along with more pros, it is also cost effective and it is just, really serviceable and easy to work on. You don't have 4 brake lines in the rear that are all flexible, you only have 2. To go with how this setup would work, a pedal box or a dual master cylinder setup of some kind, meaning there is a 1 master cylinder for the front and there is 1 master cylinder for the rear. They run independent of each other and they are connected with a bias bar or a T-bar, whatever you want to call it. Meaning when you apply the brakes, it goes through a bar and pushes both of the cylinders at the same time. Now a bias bar, you can actually add or subtract leverage from the front or back master cylinders. This is one way where you can adjust the bias or the leverage on your braking system without actually using a proportioning valve. So you're limited on the percentage difference that you can create using a bias bar. You can't go 100% and 0%, not that you would want to. With that said, if you are disrupting the rear master cylinder with an inline handbrake and you pull the handbrake, basically you are going to lock the rear brake system. And if you apply the foot brake at the same time, that bias bar is still free to move and free to apply pressure to the front brakes. So you're not going to lose brakes both front and rear if you pull an inline handbrake while having a dual master cylinder setup or a pedal box. So you are okay to run an inline handbrake with this setup. The cons, not a whole lot of cons. I have run this setup before. I do feel like there is still some weird feeling in the pedal, only because a bias bar is used to pushing both master cylinders. So it's going to give you a pedal feel that is consistent and soft with a nice gradual firmness. Basically, as you're pushing the pedal and increasing pressure, it is nice and linear and consistent. But when you pull the handbrake, it disrupts that completely. It locks one side of the bias bar and then pushes the front brakes. It is removing some of your leverage because the other cylinder is no longer moving, and it does disrupt it a little bit, but honestly, this isn't that big of a deal, especially if you're used to it. Really not too many cons with this setup, and it is much simpler. It'll save you money, it'll save you weight, and it'll be easier to service. So +1 for an inline setup with a pedal box or dual master cylinder, and I do not recommend running it in any other form. Reservoir handbrakes, or basically a handbrake that has a master cylinder with a reservoir holding its own fluid, and it is completely independent from the braking system entirely. This is basically your drop-in. Don't touch the braking system, that's factory. You could even still have ABS, although pulling the handbrake would throw that off completely, so I really don't recommend it, but it's just to the point of saying this does not mess with your factory braking system. To run this setup, you're going to need another set of calipers in the rear. We call this a dual caliper setup. You're going to need to buy dual caliper brackets. You're going to need to buy additional brake lines, fittings, hoses, hard lines, flex lines, whatever you're going to be using to run this. Typically, you would buy a universal brake line kit that companies like Drift HQ sell. They're very easy to use and they fit 99% of cars. This setup is the most common because although it's probably the most expensive, it is also the simplest and most foolproof setup that you can run. So the pros, it's always gonna work. It's always gonna lock up your rear wheels. If anything happens with your factory braking system, the handbrake system will always be independent and work on its own. You will always have a second option of applying brakes somehow. Let's say you did lose your foot brake. You can still scrub speed, slow down, do whatever with the handbrake. I do it all the time. It's a habit of mine. I mean, it's just fun because you have a big stick that applies brakes and it's really reliable. So this setup is probably going to run you a lot more, but you have a lot more options, especially with caliper setup and caliper style. Like you can run a 2-piston, you can run a 4-piston. I personally always go to like a larger 4-piston Willwood caliper, and I make my own brackets. So I make the brackets fit on whatever the rotor size is. It looks great, it feels great. The idea for me is to make a handbrake as effortless as possible. So typically I could lock up the rear wheels with a large tire just with pulling with 2 fingers. The cons of this setup are going to be minimal weight increase on your unsprung weight. So depending on the calipers that you decide to go with, you might be adding 2 to 3 pounds per caliper per wheel. And then you're gonna need some form of dual caliper bracket to hold the calipers. That might add another pound or 2. And then you need double the amount of brake lines, and it's going to be double the amount of things that could go wrong. But I don't like to think of it that way, only because it's a secondary backup system. So it would be really unlikely for your braking setup to go out and then also to lose your handbrake setup, unless of course debris or corded tire or something takes out both of your brake lines. Then of course you would be taking out both brake systems. But again, super unlikely if you route your lines properly. Not too many cons other than the weight and then of course the cost. But when it comes down to performance, cost really has no effect on as being a con, because you always have to pay to play. And in this case, your best choice for a trouble-free setup will be a dual caliper setup. Lots of options for mounting secondary calipers on all kinds of chassis. It's great. Don't forget to leave a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe to our channel, because this is what is going to push us to make more interesting videos where we can teach you, we can show you, and we can all, I don't know, leave that part out, I guess, Jack. Just the subscribe part's good.